All right, it's time for Summary Shiur. Tanya Summary Shiur, week 41, and we're in Igeres HaKodesh, the fourth part of Tanya, and we're doing chapters 14 and 15. Without any further ado, let's get right into it. So a very timely letter of the Alter Rebbe. I mean, the schedule is arranged this way for a reason. A lot of hashkacha that goes into this system, this cycle. But anyhow, the Alter Rebbe says that he wants to arouse an ancient love and cherishing of Eretz Yisrael. So he says, how am I going to do that? He says, I'm going to quote the pasuk that it says in Chumash Dvarim, Talmud De'inei Hashem lekecha ba merish shana v'ad achar shana, that the eyes of Hashem are constantly on Eretz Yisrael from the beginning of the year until the end of the year. So that in itself seems to be the only thing the Alter Rebbe says in this letter to arouse the love for Eretz Yisrael. The Alter Rebbe was very big in fundraising tzedakah for Eretz Yisrael, which I believe came up in earlier letters. So the Alter Rebbe basically says, okay, now I quoted a pasuk that brings out the love for Eretz Yisrael. He says, now I'm going to explain the pasuk a little bit. What does it mean when it says from the beginning of the year until the end of the year? If it's from the beginning of the year until the end of the year, then that means that if this year it starts and then at the end of this year it's going to be done, but then the next year it's also going to be from the beginning of that year until the end of the next year, and so on and so forth for every single year, then what you mean is constantly. That's just constantly. So why not just say constantly? Say Leilam Vod. Why do you have to say from the beginning of the year until the end of the year? So the Alter Rebbe says that everything that we have done here actually corresponds to something spiritual. That is to say that Hashem created the world, created everything in it. Now, the world is really very well fleshed out. It's very well developed. You have the year 5784, you have the year 2024, and you have 2025, and you have 5785, and every year goes into the next year. And you have, Lebanon goes into Eretz Yisrael, not in a literal sense, hopefully, but I'm saying the land flows into one land, and then Eretz Yisrael flows into Edom, and so on and so forth. Everything kind of blends smoothly together. So, in another way, there's also a spiritual dimension. There's that everything corresponds to something else that's above. You have Eretz Yisrael, physical Eretz Yisrael. Then you have all of the lands which are not really holy. Eretz Yisrael is holy in the sense that it's more in touch with spirituality, and it's really the gateway for spirituality in the world, in the sense that spirituality is more tangible in Eretz Yisrael. We can elaborate on this for a long time, but again, this is Summary Shiur, and this is already going a little bit off topic just to explain what's going on. But essentially, what is going on is that you have then the physical Eretz Yisrael, and you have the spiritual Eretz Yisrael, and you have many different levels of spiritual Eretz Yisrael, and one kind of flows into the next, the same way that you have, land, and you keep go, and you go, and you go, and the incline of the land can change gradually. So too, there's a kind of gradual incline of spiritual levels, wherein Eretz Yisrael is one of the most spiritual places that you can, like the spiritual mountain of the entire world. And then you could go higher and higher in spiritual Eretz Yisrael itself. Every other place also has a spirituality, even though it's not as in touch, etc., etc. So just to stay on track, what we're saying is that Hashem created the world and everything in it, and it exists in pure, utter completion by Hashem. But then it needs to come down into the world. It needs to come down into the world that we know and we love. The physical world, the coarse world, the world with distinct times and distinct places. So ultimately, everything flows into the next thing. Every spiritual level flows into the next spiritual level and the next one, until it becomes coarse enough in a certain sense that we're able to appreciate it down here. So that is, in general, the concept of spiritual levels flowing into one another. A very brief summary of this, which is already not exactly off topic, because it is exactly the topic of Parak Yud Daled, but just kind of rewording of everything going on over there to try to give it over in a summary form. But the point that the Alter Rebbe is making is, he says, so the same thing works with time. That is to say that Hashem exists above time, and everything is one by Hashem. And ultimately things need to be divided up into moments in time so that we can live out our lives, because the way that we perceive the universe, we don't perceive 70 or 80 years all at once. We perceive time. Every moment comes as it comes. So to that end, Hashem divides time into big chunks, and he divides it into little chunks as well. So he divides time into moments, and he divides time into days, and he divides time into years. And years are, in general, the biggest chunk that Hashem divides it into. Now, every moment he's recreating the world, and he creates it kind of as a distinct entity. Every moment is distinct, but more so than every moment is distinct, he also creates days distinctly, he also creates years distinctly. So in the same way that you have Eretz Yisrael as a distinct chunk of land that has its own special status, every year is its own distinct chunk of time that has its own special status. And every year gets a new vitality, a new pump, a new boost from Hashem. So essentially, what the pasuk that Hashem's eyes are constantly on Eretz Yisrael from the beginning of the year till the end of the year, what it's saying is that Eretz Yisrael has special providence from Hashem for each of these chunks of time, which is a year. Hashem creates the world anew every moment, every day, but particularly every year he creates a whole, in a sense, a new time cycle for the universe. So those are not all one. It's not like it's the concept of forever exists, but the point that the pasuk is trying to emphasize is that every year that comes, every largest chunk of time that exists as a discrete chunk, Hashem is constantly providing for Eretz Yisrael in that time, and Hashem is constantly boosting Eretz Yisrael to the top in everything, and including even in these largest chunks of time where you think things might be more generalized. But in general, even in general, Hashem is constantly looking out for Eretz Yisrael. And that's why it says, not forever, because it's trying to emphasize that in every size of chunk of time that Hashem creates, he is looking out for Eretz Yisrael. So that concludes chapter 14 in summary. There's a lot to elaborate on this, but this is at least in summary already. This is the shorter of the two prakim that we're doing this week. So I guess we'll see how Parak Tesvav goes. But without any further ado, let's get on to Parak Tesvav. So the Alter Rebbe essentially starts off by saying that I'm going to try to give an explanation of the parable that is used by the sages when they refer to the 10 spheres. So to start, he essentially says that we all have 10 spheres, and they all correspond to spheres above, in a similar vein to what we discussed in the last chapter. And then he says that I want to explain a concept of something that Avraham Avinu says, which is Anochi Afer Refer, which means I am but dust and ashes. So what's Avraham Avinu saying when he's saying I'm but dust and ashes? So he says, take ashes, for example. That, what is ash? Ash is when you take wood and you burn it. What does it mean to take wood and burn it? What that means is to take the wood and to remove from it all of the finer spiritual elements, or all of the finer physical elements, really. To take the water and the air and the energy that is contained within molecular bonds in the wood, and you're taking all of that and you're releasing it into the atmosphere. Air is lighter than earth, and water is lighter than earth, at least packed earth. And energy is not even necessarily a tangible thing. So what you're doing essentially is you're taking wood and you're saying all of the finer elements should go free, and you're left with only the coarsest element of the wood. You're left with what you would call the earth. You're left with the solids, the things that you can't release by burning it. That's what you're left with, just the ultimate coarseness of the wood. So how does this apply to Avraham Avinu? He says, I am but dust and ashes. So the Alter Rebbe explains that Avraham Avinu was saying something very interesting, which is that spiritually, everything exists, kind of as we explained in the last chapter, everything exists as this great combined substance. Everything is there. Everything exists by Hashem. What Avraham Avinu was saying is that this physical world is like ashes compared to a piece of wood, which is to say that really everything is this great combination of the physical and the spiritual and all of the higher realms and all of the lower realms, and it all makes up one universe. But when you take me, just Avraham Avinu as I perceive myself, says Avraham Avinu, I'm just the lowest element of that. I'm the coarsest element of that. I exist in the physical world. I exist, and I only perceive myself as existing in the physical world. I don't perceive everything that goes into me and everything that goes into the spiritual realms. I see the coarseness. I see the physicality. So what Avraham Avinu is saying is that I know that really I'm like the image of the wood. If you take a piece of wood, you burn it, it stays in the same form. But I know that I'm only seeing the coarseness of it. I know I'm not seeing really truly what the wood is. But I do know that there is some approximation for what the wood is in this image, in the ashes, in the form of the ashes. I know that there's some kind of comparison between the ashes of the wood and the wood itself existing with all of its water and air and unburned energy. So with this in mind, says Alter Rebbe, we can try to appreciate the concept of spheres, because the spheres really, in a spiritual sense, exist not as emotions or feelings. By Hashem, to say that is sacrilegious, whatever you want to call it. A lot of people have called it a lot of things over the centuries. But essentially the point is that to some extent, the same way that ashes, especially like a pile of ashes or even just a burnt piece of wood, doesn't compare to the real deal. But there is some kind of comparison. There's some way that you can appreciate what the piece of wood was when you look at the ashes. In a similar way, when we look at ourselves and we look at the spheres, the midas as we have them on our own, we're able to appreciate some extent of how they exist above. So with that in mind, the Alter Rebbe starts explaining the spheres. So in general, just gonna go really in general, because there's a lot going on. But chesed, the midah of chesed, the sphere of chesed, is the concept of supplying, the concept of giving. In general, that's expressed as kindness. That you want to give good to someone or something. Not to say that it's having mercy, because mercy means that you did a cheshbon, you did a calculation, and you thought that guy doesn't deserve or he doesn't have. And I want to give them anyway. Chesed is not about that. Chesed is just the essence of the giving. Just to give. Gvura, he says, is restraint. In a sense, it's the opposite of chesed. It's to not give. It's to withhold. Tiferes is to have a good combination of these two. He says beauty is really achieved when you have a balance. And that's what Tiferes is. Tiferes is beauty. So Tiferes represents the balance that you can have between chesed and gvura. And the next two spheres, he says, are, in a sense, playing off of chesed and gvura. Chesed exists more in regards to me, that I want to be kind, that this is my own notion, without considering that there's another person that's going to be receiving the kindness, or whatever kind of hashva, whatever kind of sustenance is being given. And gvura is also that I am feeling restrictive. It's not how does restrictiveness play out in a real world scenario, it's just restrictiveness. So the next two midas, netzach and hoid, he says, are to try to figure out how you're going to achieve your ends, or how you're going to withhold from interacting. Yisoid, the next sphere, means foundation. It's a midah of connection. Of saying that yes, there's chesed and yes, there's gvura, of giving and withholding, and there's tiferes, of having the right balance, and netzach and hoid, of how I'm actually supposed to interact. And then Yisoid is ultimately, now I've touched base. Which feels like should be a good fun, but no, that's why it's called Yisoid. It's touching base. It's touching the foundation. It's saying, okay, now I've made contact, and I have that interaction. It's ready to play out. And Malchus is, in a sense, the actual playing out of whatever it is that's supposed to happen. Malchus is the lowest level. It's the level that goes into it, actually flows. It makes the connection from whatever it is that you're trying to interact with. It's the effect. It's the action. It's the lowest level. It's the final level. But it's ultimately what makes everything worth it. It's the culmination of everything. Then says the Alter Rebbe that the source of these spheres is from a person's intellect, from the Chabad, the Chachma, Bina, and Das, the wisdom, the understanding, and the knowledge, as they're typically translated into English. Because they're all really just three words for different kinds of intellect. I don't know that the translations are exactly the best translations, not to say that I have a problem with them, but in general it's better to learn the chassidus about it to get the understanding rather than trying to match them up to one-to-one to the words of wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. But in general, the translation is wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And he says the way that you can tell that midas, that these emotions come from intellect, is because you can see that according to what a person knows, that is what they're inspired by. That is what they're inspired to by their intellect. For example, a child, he says, doesn't know what they want. They don't know much about the world. So they're not able to want. They're not able to want to give, or they're not able to want to withhold. Not because they're not capable of it, but simply because they don't know. They don't know how the world works. They don't know what there is to want or what there is to give. To whatever extent they do know, that's what they want to do. But the more that you know, the more you're able to express emotions. Or I should really say the more you're able to express relations, because that's what all of the spheres are. There are different ways of relating to other things. The Alter Rebbe says all of these concepts of what the midas are really generalities, and they all exist as spheres. I think I said midas before. I also mean spheres. Spheres and midas are often used interchangeably. Spheres are midas, not all midas are spheres. Yeah, but anyhow, so all of these spheres, all of these midas that we said before, are all spheres that exist in the world in a general sense. But he says the godly soul has spheres which correspond directly to wanting to do what Hashem wants. Chesed, to want to cleave to Hashem. by virtue of being kind, the way that Hashem is kind, and Gvura to withhold and withstand the urges of your Yetzer Hara, of your evil inclination, and so on and so forth. So then, and so on and so forth, essentially contains the rest of the chapter, which is the Alter Rebbe explaining. I mean, it's like 10% probably. The Alter Rebbe explaining different midas, all of the midas that we said, and how they express themselves in service of Hashem. This is a summary shiur, and it's a lot of detail. So see there for how all of these are expressed, but in general, that is the conclusion of chapter 15. Just a very brief summary of the concept is that there are various means by which Hashem interacts with the world. They include a general kind of intellect. How you have intellect by Hashem, it's a created thing. That's a very good conversation. And then there's the concept of interaction. How can you interact with something that doesn't yet exist? That's another whole conversation. But essentially, we can try to perceive some details about how this works by appreciating that we're created in the image of Hashem, and we're a very bad approximation of how Hashem interacts with the world. The way that we interact with the world is a very bad approximation of the way that Hashem interacts with the world. So we can try to look at ourselves and appreciate that, and we should also try to appreciate how we can use all of these faculties to try to serve Hashem to the fullest. So that concludes chapter 15, and Hashem next week we'll be discussing the mitzvah of tzedakah, both from some halachic aspects and some kabbalistic aspects. Looking forward to that, Hashem.